The restaurant was warm with golden light and the faint sound of Christmas carols, the smell of cinnamon and roasted meat drifting between the tables. But none of it softened. The moment my father stood up, his heavy chair screeching against the hardwood floor, his face flushed red with anger as he raised his hand and struck me across the face with a sharp crack that made every fork in the room pause in midair. And in that instant, as the sting spread across my cheek, I was no longer 31 years old, but 12 again, standing in our dim kitchen, with a spilled glass of milk soaking into the floor, while he loomed over me with the same rage, the same hand raised, the same words about how I ruined everything. And just as I had done back then, I froze. But this time the freeze lasted only a second before something different surged through me. Not fear, but clarity. Not shame, but control. And while the air around us shattered into silence, and he leaned forward to roar, "Christmas is better without you? Do not come back." I straightened slowly, let the burn settle into cold determination. And I smiled, not wide, not mocking, just calm and deliberate the way a soldier might smile before executing a plan. And I said, "Thank you for saying that." In public, now everyone heard you, my voice, even unsteady though. My heart hammered in my chest, and then I placed a sealed manila envelope on the table in front of him, my fingers resting on it for just a second before pulling back. And I added quietly, "I brought you something you have been demanding for years," letting the words hang heavy as the room fell into an even deeper hush. Every eye fixed on us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the power shift. Not because I fought louder, but because I chose stillness, while his fury exposed itself to the world, and while the ghost of that 12-year-old girl finally faded, replaced by a woman who is not afraid to let everyone see. My name is Claire Bennett, and I am 31 years old, a registered nurse working the ICU night shift in Columbus, Ohio, a place where the lights never dim, and the beeping of monitors is the soundtrack of my life. And for the past decade, I have lived inside that rhythm of exhaustion and responsibility, carrying other people's emergencies on my shoulders, because it was easier than admitting that my own family had always been my first emergency one, that no one ever came to treat. And if you looked at me from the outside, you would probably see a woman who has it together, hair tied back in a clean bun, scrubs pressed shoes, practical, a badge clipped neatly to her chest, someone reliable, calm, and ready to face trauma. And most nights that is true, but behind the order and the skill, there is a ledger in my head of every dollar I have sent back home, every bill I paid that was not mine, every overdraft fee I absorbed to cover my parents' late mortgage, every gas tank I filled for my younger brother Derek, so he could keep pretending he had a startup, when in reality, he had nothing but entitlement. And I know that ledger down to the cent. Because as a nurse, you learn that documentation is the difference between survival and disaster, between accountability and chaos. And I carried that instinct into my personal life, keeping every receipt and bank transfer, every text message demanding more, every voicemail dripping with guilt. And if you ask me why I kept giving, why I kept wiring money, even when it meant taking extra shifts or skipping meals, the answer is not noble. It is conditioning. Because when you grow up in a house where your father shouts louder than the TV and your mother cries quietly in corners, but then insists everything is fine, and when you learn before puberty that your worth depends on how quickly you can clean up messes you did not make, you stop asking what you deserve and you start asking what you can do to keep the peace. And for years, I told myself that peace was worth it, that if I kept sacrificing eventually, I would be noticed not as a walking wallet or a problem solver, but as a daughter. But that acknowledgement never came. Instead, it became expected, automatic, invisible. And by the time I hit my late 20s, I realized I had become a ghost in my own family's story, always present but never seen. And it took standing in that restaurant with my father's handprint burning on my cheek to remember that ghosts can also haunt, that silence can be louder than rage, and that I had spent enough of my life proving my loyalty to people who never proved theirs to me. When the message from my mother arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, I almost dropped my phone in the break room because it felt so out of character. Just a simple line that said, "Your father has calmed down. We want you to join us for dinner on Christmas Eve at Bridge and Birch. The whole family will be there, and it will be nice." And though my chest tightened with old skepticism, my fingers hovered over the screen, and a part of me, the part that still remembered being 8 years old and wishing for a place at the table with laughter instead of tension, wanted to believe it, so I typed back, "Sounds good, Mom. I will be there." And then I stared at the heart emoji she sent in return, as if it were proof of something bigger than it was. And over the following days, I let myself lean into that fantasy, imagining myself walking into the restaurant in a simple red scarf with gifts in hand, my mother's eyes misting up as she hugged me, my father gruff but softened by the holiday spirit, maybe even Derek cracking a joke that was not at my expense. And I let those pictures play in my mind on repeat during night shifts while I was adjusting ventilators or checking IV lines, and the thought of a warm meal where I was not the invisible one carried me through the long, sterile hours. And when my shift ended on December 22nd, I went straight to a modest boutique and bought myself a knit dress in winter cream and a deep red scarf. Not extravagant, but tasteful. Something that felt like a small celebration of being included. And then I stopped at a corner shop to pick out gifts. Nothing fancy, just thoughtful gloves for my mother because her hands always ached in the cold, a stainless steel travel mug for Derek because he was always borrowing mine, and a loud alarm clock for my father because I still remembered the excuses he gave every time he missed a doctor appointment. And when I got home, I cleared my tiny kitchen table and wrapped those gifts carefully with recycled paper and twine, writing each of their names on little tags. And for the first time in years, I even wrote a Christmas card addressed to all three of them. The front showing a snowy house glowing with warm light inside. I wrote the words, "Hoping this year we can start fresh." And when I finished, I propped the card up against the wrapped packages and stood back to look at them, letting myself smile, even though a voice in my head warned me not to. And later that night before work, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and practiced that smile again, testing how it would look when I walked into the restaurant. And for a fleeting moment, I believed it might be enough to melt the distance between us, and I carried that fragile rehearsal in my chest, like a secret telling myself that maybe this time my father would notice the effort, maybe this time my mother would hold me longer than a second. Maybe Derek would say thank you without sarcasm. And though beneath all of that hope lived the sharper awareness that people do not change overnight, I chose to silence it because sometimes hope feels like oxygen. And even when it is thin and dangerous, you breathe it in anyway just to stay alive. The night of Christmas Eve, the cab pulled up in front of Bridge and Birch, and snow was drifting down in lazy flakes that melted the second they touched the pavement. And for a fleeting moment, I let myself feel like a normal daughter, going to a normal family gathering. But the illusion cracked the moment I stepped inside and saw my father already seated with a drink in his hand and my mother fussing with Derek's collar, while leaving my chair empty, as if no one had expected me to arrive on time. And when I placed the wrapped gifts neatly at the end of the table, Derek smirked and muttered under his breath, "You really should not have wasted your money on cheap stuff." But I pretended not to hear and slid into my seat, telling myself to breathe and focus on the menu. Yet within minutes, the jabs began. My father asking, "So, Claire, how many lives did you save this week with your nurse?" Paycheck dripping sarcasm like acid, and Derek chiming in with a laugh that probably does not cover even half of what I make working on my startup. And when I asked what startup, he grew defensive and snapped, "You would not understand, you are too busy playing Florence Nightingale." And my mother gave me a look that was half warning, half plea, as if to say, let it go for the sake of peace. But the words kept coming like sharp stones. My father leaning back in his chair, complaining about the cost of insurance, and then turning to me with that familiar glare, saying, "If you had sent the money on time last month, we would not have had late fees." And I calmly reached into my bag and placed a folded printout on the table, showing the exact transfer with date and time, but instead of gratitude, Derek scoffed and said, "Look at her. She keeps receipts like a prison warden. No wonder nobody likes talking to you." And the sting of that remark cut deeper than I wanted to admit, because it echoed every childhood dinner where my attempts at honesty were met with ridicule, and still I kept my tone even and replied, "Documentation is how you keep people alive." But my father slammed his glass down and said, "Stop lecturing us. You think you are better because you work nights in a hospital. You are still just a burden." And before I could even respond, my mother leaned forward with a shaky smile and whispered, "Claire, sweetheart, please do not spoil the holiday. Your father does not mean it. He just gets worked up." And when I said quietly, "Mom, he just called me a burden," she shook her head and insisted, "You know how he is. It is better not to challenge him," as if the problem were not the insult, but my refusal to swallow it. And hearing that from her cut worse than Derek's mockery, because it was the same line she had used all my life to excuse him, the same plea to be quiet for the sake of peace, while my peace was never considered, and the room grew heavier as the tension mounted, until finally my father's temper erupted fully. He shoved back his chair, stood up, and struck me across the face, the heat of his palm exploding against my cheek, and before I could even process the sting, he leaned forward and shouted, "Christmas is better without you, do not come back." His voice echoing through the restaurant like a verdict, and in that instant, betrayal crystallized into something almost pure, because it was no longer whispered behind closed doors or hidden in guilt trips. It was out in the open, under the golden lights for everyone to see, and as silence fell around us, I realized that what had once been my greatest fear, being cast out publicly, had just transformed into my greatest weapon. The sting on my cheek in that restaurant carried me backward through time like a door slamming open to every moment I had tried to bury. And I saw myself at 12 again, standing in the kitchen, with a puddle of milk spreading across the linoleum, while my father towered above me, shouting that I was careless and useless before striking the back of my head so hard my ears rang. And I remembered the way my mother rushed in not to defend me, but to hush me, saying it is just how he gets when he is stressed. And then came the memory of Derek at 8 years old throwing a baseball through the neighbor's window, while I was blamed for not watching him and forced to hand over the cash from my babysitting job to pay for the repairs. And I thought of being 16, saving for months at the diner where I worked part-time, dreaming of buying a secondhand car, only to have my father demand the envelope of bills to fix the roof, and then weeks later watch him hand Derek a brand new guitar for his birthday, the roof still leaking the guitar, shining like proof that his mistakes were always forgiven. And I felt again the cold weight of my high school graduation when I stood on the stage scanning the crowd, only to realize not one familiar face was there, because my mother said Derek had a fever, and they could not risk leaving him yet. Somehow later that same evening, pictures appeared on social media of my family, smiling at his Little League banquet, and I thought of the first time I brought home an acceptance letter to nursing school, and how my father muttered, "Figures, you want to run away instead of doing something useful here," while Derek announced he was dropping out of community college to focus on his app idea, and was met with applause, and the memories kept piling one on top of the other. The Thanksgiving when my father shoved me into the wall for challenging him about drinking and driving, and my mother whispered, "Do not make him angry," in that same trembling tone she used every year. And then the Christmas, when I was 10 and I crept downstairs early to see 3 stockings on the mantel, one for my father, one for my mother, one for Derek, but none for me. And when I asked later where mine was, my mother said, "Oh, we forgot, but do not make a fuss. You know your father gets upset when you act dramatic." And the Christmas when I was 15, and Derek tore open the biggest box under the tree, a new bike gleaming with ribbons, while I sat holding a mug that said "Naughty List," and everyone laughed as if it were a harmless joke. And the Christmas when I was 19, home from my first semester of nursing school, and I offered to help cook, but my father barked, "You are just in the way. Go study, if you are so smart." And my mother echoed, listen to your father, and those holidays carved into me. The truth that joy in that house belonged to Derek, while I was expected to keep quiet and carry burdens. And as I sat in that restaurant with the heat of his latest slap fading into cold clarity, I understood that none of this had been accidental. It was a system carefully maintained, a hierarchy, where Derek was the miracle son. My mother was the appeaser. My father was the tyrant. And I was the crutch, expected to carry them all in silence. But what they had never realized was that silence does not mean weakness. It only means I was gathering strength to one day stop carrying them all together. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, before that dinner table erupted, I had already begun to make changes. Quiet changes that no one noticed because they never thought to look closely at me. And it started with something small: the autopay settings on the utility account, the car insurance tied to my card, the mortgage portal that had my income listed as the guarantor, all the little invisible strings that had kept their house and their lives afloat. And one by one, I cut those strings not impulsively, but carefully, drafting formal emails to each company, stating that all communication should now be directed to the primary borrower, my father signing off politely with best regards, and saving every confirmation in a folder on my laptop, and then I opened a new savings account under a trust, with my name only transferring what little I had left after years of funneling half my paycheck into their debts. And though the balance was modest compared to what I had given away, it felt like air filling my lungs for the first time in years, like oxygen. I had been denying myself. And once that account was secure, I turned to the evidence, the years of screenshots, transfers, voicemails, and paper trails that I had kept, not out of spite, but out of habit. The same way a nurse charts everything, because what is not written down might as well not exist. And I spent nights off shift printing, hole punching, and tabbing every page into binders red for utilities, blue for mortgage, yellow for Derek's endless car repairs, green for medical bills that were supposedly emergencies, but suspiciously lined up with vacations they took without telling me. And when I finished, the stack was taller than my coffee table and heavier than the guilt they had always tried to pile on me. And I realized I had turned my pain into something undeniable, something no one could twist or gaslight away. And still, I wanted more than paper. I wanted witnesses. So I reached out to Grace Holloway, a retired court clerk I had once treated kindly during a hospital stay. And when I told her everything, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Claire, you already have more than most people ever manage to gather. You are ready if you choose to be." And she gave me the number of an attorney named Naomi Cole, a woman with a reputation for cutting through excuses like a scalpel. And when I met Naomi in her quiet office with walls lined with case files, I slid the first binder across her desk and watched her expression sharpen as she flipped through her pen, tapping once against the page before she said, "Claire, you understand you are not just dealing with family conflict. You are dealing with financial exploitation and documented abuse. And if you are willing, we can move this from whispers into the language of the law." And though fear twisted in my stomach, I nodded because I knew she was right. And from that moment, we drafted the documents together: a letter of financial termination, a formal notification of debt responsibility, and most importantly, the beginnings of a protective order that could be triggered if physical violence occurred. And as we laid out the steps, Naomi said, one thing that echoed in my mind for days. She said, "You do not need to scream for justice, you just need to prepare for it." And that became my mantra. So when my mother texted the invitation to Christmas dinner, I already knew that whatever happened at that table would not end there. It would simply trigger the chain reaction I had set in motion. And to seal that plan, I slipped a manila envelope into my bag. The night of December 24th, inside it, a neatly typed letter ending all financial support, notarized, and signed, a summary of the binders with key highlights and a copy of the draft protective order ready to be filed. And I carried that envelope not as a threat, but as a shield, a silent declaration that I was done financing my own erasure, and on the outside of the envelope in clean black ink, I wrote his name, Ronald Bennett, so there could be no doubt about who it belonged to. And as I looked at it in the taxi on the way to the restaurant, I thought of the girl I had been at 12, at 16, at 20. Always the one blamed, always the one sacrificed. And I whispered softly to her, "You did not gather all of this for nothing tonight. You will finally see it matter." And with that, I straightened my scarf, adjusted the envelope in my bag, and prepared not for a family reunion, but for a reckoning. The silence after the slap stretched so long it felt like the whole restaurant was holding its breath, and my father's voice still echoed in the air like smoke after a fire. "Christmas is better without you. Do not come back." And I could feel every stranger at Bridge and Birch watching us. Forks suspended, drinks untouched, a dozen conversations frozen mid-sentence. And instead of lowering my head or excusing myself, I sat straighter, placed the manila envelope in the center of the table, and tapped it once with my finger, a small sound that somehow cut through the hush like a gavel. And I said evenly, "This is for you, Dad. You have been demanding it for years." And the way his eyes narrowed told me he expected cash. Another bailout. Another invisible sacrifice. But when he reached for the envelope, I pulled it back slightly and said, "Not so fast." And the tension in the room coiled tighter. My mother whispering, "Claire, stop making a scene, please. People are staring." Derek muttering, "Just give him whatever it is so we can get through dinner." But I ignored them because for the first time in my life, the eyes of strangers gave me strength, their presence proof that what was happening was real, and not some twisted memory to be gaslighted away later. And I slid the envelope across the table toward my father with deliberate calm, his hand snatching it open, papers spilling out neatly typed letters, notarized documents, copies of transfers. And as he flipped through, confusion flickered across his face, confusion curdling into rage, when he realized these were not checks, but receipts, records, evidence, and the top sheet was a signed termination of all financial support, effective immediately with my signature and a witness stamp. And before he could speak, I said loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear documentation. "Is the language you taught me. You always said nothing counts unless you can prove it. Well, here is the proof." And Derek leaned forward, his face red. "Give me that. You do not get to pull this stunt." But I pressed my palm flat on the stack before he could grab it, and met his eyes with a calm that felt carved from stone and said, "Derek, these are not stunts. These are records of every time I saved you from repossession, every time I paid your insurance, every time you crashed a car and walked away without consequence, and now the consequences are arriving right here, right now." And my mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached for my hand, whispering, "Claire, honey, do not do this. We are family." But I pulled my hand back and said softly, "Family does not treat me like an ATM with legs. Family does not slap their daughter in public and expect silence." And my father slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses rattle and snarled. "You think this makes you better than us? You think paperwork can erase blood?" And I smiled just faintly and answered, "No, Dad, it does not make me better. It makes me free." And at that moment, a calm female voice cut into the standoff, and I turned to see Naomi Cole standing by the table, her briefcase in hand, her presence composed and sharp, and she said, "Actually, Mr. Bennett, paperwork can do more than erase blood. It can establish responsibility and consequences. I was invited here tonight as counsel for Claire." And the collective gasp around the room felt like oxygen rushing in, because now this was no longer just a family squabble. It was something official, something undeniable. And my father sputtered, "You brought a lawyer to dinner." And Naomi placed a card on the table, sliding it toward him like a dealer with aces, and said no. She brought accountability at this point. The restaurant manager approached nervously, asking, "Is everything all right here?" And I answered yes, but please note for your incident log that my father struck me across the face at approximately 7:30 p.m. in front of multiple witnesses. And the manager nodded wide-eyed, promising to make a note while my father's jaw clenched so hard, I thought it might break, and Derek hissed, "You cannot humiliate us like this." And I turned to him quietly, letting my calm voice do what screaming never had. Humiliation requires innocence. Derek, this is just exposure. And I saw a woman at the next table whisper to her husband, "She is right, I saw him hit her." And with that chorus of strangers supporting me, I knew I had already won more than I ever had at home. But Naomi was not finished. She pulled out a smaller envelope and said, "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett Derrick, I advise you to read carefully what Claire has assembled. There are signed records, bank statements, and preliminary filings for a protective order, should physical violence continue." At this point, my father tried to laugh it off, muttering, "She is bluffing," but his voice shook. And Naomi met his gaze like a surgeon cutting into denial and said, "Bluffing is for cards. I deal in facts, and facts are here in black and white." And my mother pleaded again, whispering, "Please do not drag this into court." But I shook my head gently and said, "Mom, it has already been in court my whole life. The court of your silence, the court of his rage, the court where Derek is always acquitted, and I am always guilty tonight. I am changing the verdict." And with that, I gathered the papers back into the envelope, tucked it under my arm, and stood placing enough cash for my meal on the table, telling the manager, "Thank you for your professionalism." And as I turned to leave, my father hissed, "You are making a mistake, Claire. You will regret this." And I stopped just long enough to look over my shoulder and say, "No, Dad." The mistake was thinking I would never stop paying for my own erasure. And then I walked out into the snowy night, the cold air hitting my skin like baptism. And for the first time in years, I felt taller than the man who had always loomed over me, because I had made my silence louder than his rage. And the witnesses in that restaurant would carry the truth longer than his denials ever could. The night after the dinner, my phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from my father and Derek. Some from blocked numbers, some with voicemails full of threats and guilt trips. But I let them pile up untouched, because I knew silence was my shield. And the next morning, I walked into Naomi Cole's office with the envelope still under my arm and the restaurant manager's written statement already emailed to her. And together, we filed the first motion, a request for a temporary restraining order against my father on grounds of public assault, witnessed by multiple individuals and documented by a business log. And within 48 hours, a judge signed the order, granting immediate protection, forbidding him from contacting me directly, indirectly, or approaching within 200 feet. And when the papers were served to his doorstep, Derek called me screaming that I had ruined Christmas, that Dad was humiliated, that Mom would never forgive me. And then his voice cracked as he shouted, "You cannot do this to us! I am your brother, you owe me." And hearing the desperation behind his rage almost made me laugh, because after years of his entitlement, the only thing he feared was losing access to the resources he thought would always be his. And as the legal machinery turned, Naomi also filed a demand for restitution. Attaching the binders of records I had built line by line of money siphoned under pressure, totaling more than $60,000 over a decade. And though she warned me it was unlikely the court would award full reimbursement, she insisted it was vital to establish a paper trail of exploitation. And at the preliminary hearing, my father tried to sneer through his lawyer that family support is voluntary. But Naomi rose like steel and reminded the court that coerced financial dependency paired with documented abuse is not generosity, it is exploitation. And as she spoke, I saw the judge's expression tighten, his pen scribbling notes, and my father's bluster shrank in real time. Derek, however, could not contain himself. He stood up mid-session and shouted, "This is a setup. She is lying. She is jealous because I am the one who is supposed to carry the family name." And the judge banged his gavel, ordering him to sit. And I watched Derek's face turn the color of spoiled wine as the bailiff moved closer. And for once in his life, he felt consequences, not indulgence. And then came the moment that shifted everything further, when the courtroom doors opened and my grandfather Walter walked in with his cane tapping against the floor, his presence unexpected but commanding. and he asked permission to address the court. And when it was granted, he looked directly at my parents and at Derek and said, "I have watched this family rot from the inside for decades, and I stayed silent too long. But silence is over, because what I saw in that restaurant was only the final straw in a long history of cruelty toward Claire." And then he handed the judge a sealed packet containing his updated will, notarized and filed 2 weeks earlier, declaring Claire as the sole beneficiary of his estate, a modest house and savings. But symbolically, everything, leaving my father, my mother, and Derek with nothing. And when the judge asked why, Walter said, "Because she is the only one who ever treated me with dignity, who visited when I was sick, who fixed my gutters without being asked, who never once demanded money or favors. She showed me what family means when the rest of you showed me what greed looks like." And the silence in that courtroom was heavier than the restaurant silence had been, because now there was no way to pretend this was exaggeration. This was the law and bloodline cutting ties at the same time. And my father's lawyer stammered about contesting the will, but Walter shook his head and said it has already been filed with my attorney and notarized properly. "You will waste your breath and your money chasing what you no longer deserve." Derek at that point completely unraveled, yelling, "This is theft. She manipulated you. She brainwashed you." And Walter's voice cut clean through his tantrum. "No, Derek, I simply saw what you are and what she is, and I chose accordingly." And Derek collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, the weight of reality finally cracking the arrogance that had been built into him since childhood. And when the session adjourned, Naomi leaned toward me and whispered, "Justice does not always come clean, but this is as close as I have seen in years." And I nodded, feeling both hollow and whole. Hollow from the years wasted, but whole from the weight finally shifting off my chest. And over the following weeks, consequences piled on, like dominoes. My father faced misdemeanor assault charges and mandatory anger management classes. Derek lost his car insurance and his license was suspended after unpaid fines came to light. And in the community itself, the ripple spread. The restaurant gossip traveled through the neighborhood. People who once admired my father's loud charisma now crossed the street to avoid him. The pastor at the church announced he would be removed from volunteer duties, citing a need for safety. And several of Derek's so-called business partners dropped him overnight once they realized his funding was gone. Even the local paper ran a short piece about a protective order filed after a holiday assault, though no names were printed. Everyone in town knew. And for the first time, it was not me who carried shame in public. It was them. And when the estate transfer from Walter finalized, I stood in his modest living room surrounded by boxes and realized the twist of justice was not about property or money. It was about permanence, about having a home that could not be taken from me, a place earned not by bending to rage, but by being seen. And I promised myself in Walter's memory that this house would not just be a shelter for me, but a place of peace for others. A space where no one would ever be struck across the face for speaking truth. And as winter melted into spring, the restraining order became permanent. Restitution was ordered in partial installments, even if they would likely never pay. And the inheritance stood unchallenged. And in the quiet of my new kitchen, I realized that the most powerful twist was not that they lost, but that I had finally won the right to live without them to define family, not by blood, but by dignity. And that realization was the justice I had been waiting for all my life. The first morning I woke up in my grandfather Walter's house. The winter sun slanted through the thin curtains and landed across a wooden floor that creaked under my bare feet. And the silence inside those walls was so different from the silence I grew up with, because it was not charged with dread or coated with guilt. It was simply stillness, the kind of stillness that lets you breathe, without bracing for the sound of footsteps or the slam of a door. And I stood in the small kitchen with a chipped counter making coffee in a pot older than me, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was trespassing in my own life. I felt rooted, like this space belonged to me, not because I had fought for scraps, but because someone had seen my worth and named it. And as I unpacked boxes, I found old photographs of Walter smiling with me on the porch from summers long ago, when I had helped him paint the fence. And in one picture, my hair was tangled and my hands were covered in white streaks. But he looked proud, and I realized that pride had been rare in my life. So rare, I had almost forgotten what it felt like. And I placed that photo on the mantle as a reminder that even one person believing in you can outweigh a lifetime of being dismissed. And in the days that followed, I started small rituals to reclaim myself. I opened the windows and let the cold air in. I bought secondhand furniture that I arranged exactly the way I wanted without anyone criticizing. I set up a little reading nook with a blanket and a lamp and a shelf of books I had never had time to enjoy. And in that corner, I began writing not dramatic novels or confessions, just notes to myself about boundaries, about how silence can be powerful when it is chosen instead of imposed, about how you do not owe endless loyalty to people who trade your devotion for contempt. And each sentence felt like stitching a wound closed from the inside. And though my phone still buzzed with numbers I did not save and messages I did not open, I stopped flinching because the restraining order was not just a piece of paper. It was proof that the law could protect me when my family would not. And as weeks turned into months, I saw the consequences ripple outward. I heard through neighbors that my father had been forced to attend anger management, and that Derek had lost his license after another unpaid fine. And though a part of me once would have rushed in to fix those crises, I did nothing. And in that nothingness, I discovered peace. Because sometimes the bravest act is not rescuing, but refusing. And when my mother reached out timidly with a picture of a paid utility bill in her name and a note saying, "I am trying," I sent back only a single heart emoji. Not a conversation, not an invitation, just a symbol that she could choose her own path. But I would not walk it for her. And that boundary was the truest gift I had ever given myself. And as spring arrived, I turned one of the spare bedrooms into a quiet rest space for night shift nurses who needed a safe place to crash between shifts, a tiny gesture in honor of Walter, and a declaration that this house would be filled with care instead of cruelty. And the first time a colleague napped there and thanked me with tears in her eyes, I realized that cycles can be broken, that legacy is not only what you inherit, but what you choose to create. And now, as I sit here writing this, I know some people listening might wonder if I regret cutting ties, if the silence from my parents feels like a loss. But the truth is, I have lost nothing. I have only returned what was never mine to carry. And I want anyone hearing my story, especially those who have been told they are selfish for setting boundaries or cruel for refusing to be controlled, to know that you are not alone, you are not wrong, and you are not unworthy of peace. You can smile calmly in the face of rage. You can place your evidence on the table and walk away. You can build a life where your stillness is safety, not punishment. And if you are waiting for permission, let this be it. Let this be the voice that tells you, enough is enough. You do not owe your abusers another year, another dollar, another ounce of your strength. You deserve mornings where the only sound is a kettle boiling or birds outside your window, not shouting, not slamming doors. And you deserve to know that sometimes family is not who shares your blood, but who respects your boundaries. And sometimes the greatest justice is simply living free, while those who tried to control you face the weight of their own choices. So tell me what you think. Do you believe I was right to draw the line? Would you have walked out of that restaurant too? Or would you have stayed one more night hoping for change? Because I already know my answer, and it is written in every quiet breath I take in this house I chose to leave, and I chose to live.